Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Veriff Voices, the podcast where we talk about fraud, compliance, technology, and all things related to digital identity and returning trust to the internet. Today, we're going to be focusing in on digital transformation, which is an incredibly interesting topic, and I've got an amazing guest with me today to help me do so. It's Dr. Leda Glyptis, who is, among many things, a banking veteran. I've seen you described as an author, a financial services expert. I'm sure there's so much more. Welcome, first of all, and thank you for joining us. I know you're incredibly busy.
Thank you so much for having me.
No problem. And I think, so just tell us, I mean, I mentioned some of the highlights there, but give us a bit more about your background, your kind of journey to where you've got to so far, and also what you do now. I think that's the most interesting part of all.
Yeah, of course. I describe myself as a banking veteran to stomach it, to be honest with you. Because a good few years ago, I got a Banking Veterans Award.
Oh, there you go.
And that was like a slap, it was. Because I was like, I'm not old enough. But of course, turns out I am. Yeah. As you say, I have been in financial services for a very long time now. We're inching into the third decade, which is terrifying. And I've mostly done transformation work. It was called transformation for a time. It was called innovation for a time. It's called transformation again. But it's always at that cycle of new technology, old problems, and people structures. I've been in-house in banks for many a year. Done business process reengineering, new tech launches, innovation, and then in the last few years I worked on the core banking side. So similar problems, different side of the fence. And now, as of a couple of years ago, I work independently as an advisor to big corporates transforming and smaller entities either trying to expand or trying to sell into big companies. The job hasn't changed. It sounds dramatically different, but the job hasn't changed. It's the same sets of problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because I've worked sort of adjacent to financial services for many years from the marketing side of things, and I know that I've been writing about digital transformation for a long time. So it feels like it's a subject that just doesn't go away, isn't it? It's one of those things.
You occasionally see someone going, "This is new," and you're like, "Oh, welcome."
The names change slightly, but I think the main story is the same, isn't it? And actually, on that then, just to sort of set things off, you've said before that digital transformation is more about people and process than it is about technology. Is that something that still holds true? I mean, given the sort of the speed with which we're sort of flying through new technologies these days, is that something that you still find in your work?
I actually feel it is even more true than it's ever been before. Even though we lose a lot of sleep around specific technologies, particularly around the fraud side of things, because every time a new technology comes into the mix, the bad guys have it as well as the good guys, and they tend to be very, very creative and innovative. So there is an element of anxiety around technologies per se. There's an element of anxiety on not being left behind, regulatory adoption or not. But the reality is, what you're going to do with a new technology, where you're going to put it, whether you're going to replace something or create an additive setup, all of those are human decisions. How well you will determine where to use it, how to use it, how to harmonize it with what else you have. All of those are human decisions, operational, process, structure decisions. And I'm actually finding that as technology change comes at us faster, big organizations are at least beginning to accept that they don't have time to learn it themselves. So that throws the human problems into even sharper relief, because if you don't have the excuse of needing to learn everything about APIs so you can build your own API gateway, like we did once upon a time, but you accept that you'll bring experts in to help you, why is it still taking you so long to work out what to do with it if you don't have to build it? So I think it's more than ever not about technology.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think, what about, obviously Veriff is a big player in the digital identity space, and that's the subject I'd like to sort of focus in on today, if that's okay. But where does digital identity fit into the bigger picture of transformation projects with financial services organizations? Where do you think it sort of fits in? Is it a priority? Is it something that is sort of a secondary concern? Or where do you think is the sort of the bigger picture there, do you think?
So I think digital identity was one of those topics that in so many ways it encapsulates the emotional trajectory of financial services in this, because it's complicated, and therefore at first a lot of digital processes kind of left it aside. I mean, we used to call onboarding the big hairy beast. So when inside banks, you would digitize everything apart from onboarding. Yeah. Which is insane if you try to explain it to someone who's not. But of course, one of the biggest issues was creating a single customer view and a single customer identity asset. creating the right approvals and the right access. And of course, all of that is technically possible, but it was very tricky. And then you see that urge across financial services globally of, well, it's a government question. The minute you have a digital identity asset formalized by government, then we'll just work within those parameters. Until that time, you see more reluctance than not.
Yeah.
I think it's I'm going to derail the conversation. You should stop me. But I think it's a very interesting space because there's a lot of creativity we could have here, but we don't. I had a conversation with someone. I've actually, I've written about it, but it's not published yet. So depending on when this is out, it might actually be ahead of the blog.
Yeah, okay.
But I wrote a piece on the back of a conversation I had with a cab driver in Johannesburg. The guy was not technical at all, but he was talking about open banking. I don't think he knew he was talking about open banking, but essentially he was talking about the fact that if I have my bank on my phone and my phone has face recognition in a country of carjackings, why can the phone tell I'm afraid? And it was a very difficult moment because the honest answer is it could, but nobody asked for that use case.
Yeah.
So you go back to the question, and I would say identity is on everyone's mind, mostly looking to the government to solve it first.
Okay.
And although we could have immense amounts of creativity, there is a little bit of nervousness around overreaching, around compromising freedom for security or security for access. And although we could and should have more dialogue, we don't.
Yeah.
Very long answer for your question.
No,
Sorry
that's
about
great.
That.
There's a lot there to unpack, actually. And I think that, so do you think there is a sort of, maybe a misunderstanding maybe around what, or misapprehension maybe around what identity is and what it can potentially do when it comes to financial services in terms of how much easier it can make onboarding or how much smoother it can make the flows and things like that? Is there I mean, there is always a sort of a natural conservatism that comes with financial services, I suppose. But what do you think?
Yes, I mean, I'll tell you two stories, and if they have not answered your question, I'll answer it properly. The first story was actually around AI, not identity, but I did a closed door conversation with some really cool, innovative solutions that can do migrations using AI. Regulators and banks, and effectively the regulator was like, "Look, I'm not gonna bless this, but actually I'm comfortable with what I'm hearing." So I said to the banks, "What would it take for you to do this?" And the answer they all gave me behind closed doors was to go third.
Okay.
So that's my first half to your an answer to the question. The second half is quite a few years back. I was asked to interview a guy called Nikhil Kumar, absolutely brilliant human being and brilliant engineer. He worked for India Stack at the time for UPI. I'm fangirling about public service infrastructures in general and UPI in particular. So we talked a lot about Aadhaar, the identity asset. And I got off the stage to an avalanche of death threats on social media, which I've never had before or since, because I don't exactly work in an exciting part of the world. You don't normally, and sort of that's the second half of the answer. So Aadhaar, and I hope I don't get more death threats. Aadhaar tried to cut to the heart of the question you asked and said, if we want to create something that is easy to onboard, easy to verify for a combination of public services and private services, then what we need to do is have a transferable, reusable asset that has as little information as possible, but information that is uniquely held and verifiable. Yeah. So we mostly don't have that, and I would say that it's not a misunderstanding, it's a common failure mode. That when we start thinking about identity verification, the things we decide to hold, capture, verify, like leave the how aside, we overload it. It's the reason why if you're a bank, your customer can't just have a single transferable identity asset across the board because you need, from a regulatory perspective, different information. So you've just created a new asset. How you do the verification for that asset is probably exactly the same. Yeah. the customer is treated as if they're different because you've overloaded the thing. So obviously, playing into your space, how you do the verification, we have technology at our fingertips that solves 90% of the problems.
Yeah.
But we come in overcomplicating the problem before we even get out of the gate.
Yes.
Does that answer your question?
It absolutely does. Yeah, yeah. And I'm conscious. I sort of want to take that a little bit further, actually. So, do you think that is the future? Do you think that's where we're heading? That sort of reusable identity piece that banks possibly taking on their own kind of identity verification. Once a customer's been verified, they know that that's the legitimate customer, that they're a genuine human being, that they can be trusted, and they're a sort of a valued customer, as it were, and not somebody who's going to do harm to their systems. Do you think that's something that we're going to see, the sharing of data like that, in the same way that we have other data when it comes to open banking and those kinds of things?
So if you had asked me that question a few years back, I would have unequivocally said yes.
Yeah.
And in fact, there are a few countries in Europe, Norway being one of them, where that bank identity works backwards.
Yeah.
Because it's trusted, it's verified, it's not overloaded with information, and it allows you to prove things here and there. It's the same concept as your driver's license proving that you're of age to drink, but actually much more useful, much more useful. I think the challenge that holds banks back now is deepfakes. And of course, the answer to those things is always, if we had gotten on with a program 10, 15 years ago, when, say, Norway did, we would be so much smarter about this now. It would still be scary, but it wouldn't be as terrifying as it looks now.
Yes.
All that said, and I know that sitting in London having this conversation is going to make people really uncomfortable, the move for digital identity, government-issued digital identity, is relentlessly moving in one direction.
Yeah.
We are not going to be left behind on that. So it's going to be done one way or another. It's just a shame that it's kicking and screaming rather than leaning in to say, well, these are the things we need to solve for. This is the technology we have. These are the things that we're worried about. Where does the circle close? Yeah.
Do you think then that is something that is going to be regulator driven? In terms of, do you think that the regulations have to come first, then the businesses will fall into line, or do you think it's something that somebody's going to be an innovator on this and just sort of push it ahead?
In financial services, particularly in the markets that I've historically operated in, I hate to say this, but we have followed the regulatory direction of travel.
Yeah.
With the exception of algo trading, I don't remember creative applications of technology that weren't first directionally approved by the regulator. And algo trading is a long time ago. I actually shocked some of my students recently by first making them guess the date and then showing them the actual date. So I think it will be driven by the regulator. Now, you might argue that's actually as it should be.
Yeah.
But I think some of the creativity should come in. And often when I have these conversations with regulators, they would like to see where the industry, both the inventors and the users, because I wouldn't expect that financial services would invent the capabilities. They don't need to. They have people like you to help them actually implement. But coming in and saying, this is what the problem looks like. So if you're a bank today, say a retail bank, I need to be able to do a few very simple things. I need to be able to verify you are who you are every time you come in through my door, be it for all of your different touch points with me, but also the fact that you might be a corporate treasurer who's my customer on the other side and you're still the same person. I need to be able to verify all of that with different permissions for each act. Actually, we can do that right now. The technology to do that exists. And I need to be able to protect against deep fakes. The technology against that is being developed. Yeah. I wouldn't say we're there 100%. It's all very new, but I don't need to tell you that. You know that. The urge inside a lot of banks who've been at the receiving end of deepfakes is to go back to branches for retail. You're like, well, okay, what about the ones who don't have them? What about the ones that actually have an entire customer base predicated on the fact that they didn't want that?
Yeah.
We need that creativity. I suspect the regulator will have to come first, though.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. And do you think, generally speaking, as a rule, regulators sort of hinder creativity, or do you think that they drive it? Is there or is it a bit of both?
I think historically, particularly for financial services. Regulators have driven it.
Yeah.
I remember sitting in a room with CTOs over the years telling me open source software is the devil. The cloud will never catch on. API first architecture is for the likes of eBay, and we don't sell shoes here, darling. And on and on and on. And the reality was that people came to the table whether they liked it or not, because the regulator created either an expectation for actually API first architecture was an expectation.
Yeah.
And then everything else, it became a competitive edge. When the regulator comes into a particular market and says, actually, public cloud is permitted, somebody will go first. That somebody will change the landscape. Whether you like it or not, you have to come in. So my answer to your question is regulators have been absolutely driving this. But they've been driving it in lockstep with the wider economy.
Yeah.
I think there's an interesting, to go back to my taxi driver from the other day, there's an interesting question that goes, open banking, we all instinctively get that it's good.
Yeah.
The use cases for it have not been very exciting yet. But we're all waiting for it. We've all spent a truckload of cash getting ready for it, so we might as well. But commercially it hasn't quite happened. Yeah. But in terms of failure modes, we've had some scary ones. So Brazil being an example, with the kidnappings and the fear that my cab driver had. So as an individual, do I want that protection more than I want the freedom of not having that power delegated? Yeah. I think the answer would depend very differently if you thought that being kidnapped is likely.
Yes.
That will never happen without a regulator saying we should think about it. But imagine the feeling of a driver who drives across Johannesburg every night knowing he could be carjacked.
Yeah.
Now I'm nervous advocating for it, but the technology allows us to think about problems differently. And someone will be sitting here going, that's terrifying, that's Minority Report, don't do it. And the other side will be like, actually, safety first.
Yeah.
And providers like yourselves would be sitting in the middle going, when you decide, I've got it for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that what that sort of comes down to is that there are maybe multiple drivers to innovation, actually, aren't there? It's the the regulatory piece is the one we've spoken about here in a bit of depth there, but there's also a kind of a customer service angle to all of this. You want to make a seamless experience for your customers so they can log into your platform quickly, safely, securely, know that their data is going to be protected, and all of these sort of follow-on points. So do you think the sort of the fraud angle to this, especially in relation to deepfakes, which you've mentioned a couple of times, do you think that's a sort of an equally powerful driver to the sort of regulatory piece, or do the two just go hand in hand together?
I think right now, in general, I think you could say the two go hand in hand. Yeah. Right now, it is an extremely powerful driver because it came, well, it didn't come out of nowhere, but it felt like it came out of nowhere for a lot of people. And I remember, God, I'm aging myself now, but about 20 years ago, I remember sitting in the iconic building of Lloyd's of London for a cybersecurity conference, which was as dull and grey and dry as you can imagine. And there was someone there from MI5 who was fascinating. It was 20 odd years on, and you still remember the talk. But effectively, the talk said the minute you have a networked computer, there's vulnerability in the system, right? So if you want to be totally secure, pen and paper. That should be your starting point. Everything you do on top of that is a compromise. Now, that is a terrible way to think, but it's actually a very interesting way to think, because we're already where we are. The question I'm not hearing enough of is, should we go back to first principles and do it differently? So around deep fakes, to go back to your question, I've heard a lot of people going pen and paper. Let's go back to the things that can't be faked.
Yeah.
But they can.
Yeah.
I'm hearing a lot of additional protections, but I'm not hearing, okay, well, it's a new world out there. Should we go back to first principles? So if we go back to pen and paper with the intention of meeting the future where it's at, do we have a fortress that isn't fit for purpose anymore? And rather than panicking or adding things, should we actually scrap and rebuild certain pieces? Now, I know why people are not having that conversation. That is a terribly expensive conversation.
Yeah.
But it's an essential one, especially when it comes to security. It's essential for operations as well, because complexity slows you down.
Yeah.
For security, the conversation we're not having and should be having is, if we go back to nothing, how would we build it up to here? Yeah,
that's a really interesting way to approach that. I'm a bit nervous to agree with you about that need for retreat, sort of back to pen and paper, to be honest with you, because I feel like to me is that, the internet as a whole, not just in financial services, offers so much potential for what humans can do, how we can connect with each other and all of this kind of thing. So to back away from it because there's a lack of trust into the interactions that we're having feels like a backward step. But I think you're right. I mean, maybe there is some rebuilding that needs to be done in order to get to that
so
point.
It is a backward step, and I want to clarify that I think it's a mental retreat, so I don't want us to go back to pen and paper and think about it. I want us to mentally say, if none of what we had, despite the amortization schedules and the money and political capital spent, if none of what we had was here, how would you build from scratch for today's threat? I suspect you'd build differently. The danger with that is that when you can't protect in a complicated world, I have seen banks, CISOs go, we may have to go to not a purely physical set of interactions, but a phygital sense of interactions where we anchor on something that is not impossible to forge. Come on, we all know. I mean, I traveled on a Greek passport, and there were times when there was some entirely unnecessary blue squiggly lines on the critical page, decorative and terrible, and they made the passports actually particularly easy to forge. And traveling as a young woman at the time, I got stopped time and again at customs until one day I was traveling with my dad. He's like, "Why are you stopping her?" I said, "We're really sorry, but we have a lot of people trafficking, young women, people trafficking." And it was like, oh my God. So physical documents are actually very easy to forge if you're that way inclined. So the question should be, for today's threat world, if you didn't have all the legacy you have, how would you build it? Now, you do have the legacy.
Of course,
But the thinking can't be, how do I mend the leaky bucket?
Yes.
It has to be, do I need a bucket at all?
Yeah. And I think the trouble sort of with that too is that it has to be balanced against your sort of customer expectations too, especially in a retail banking setting, if we're focusing on that for a moment. People, you and I, we're used to the things being quick, to being easy, seamless. Amazonification. I think that's a word I've heard sort of bandied around. It's a hard one to pronounce, but that sort of ease of use, people now expect from those organisations where there should be, I think, layers of friction to sort of create that sort of, for financial services institutions particularly. So I think it's sort of buffering up against that kind of customer expectation as well. Is that something that bothers the financial leaders that you work with and that kind of thing too?
It's interesting because there are certain things that are accepted as gospel for different eras of our evolution, right? Yeah. And frictionless banking was a pill we all swallowed. Yeah. And I remember a time speaking to friends who are on the policy side, regulatory side, or in compliance functions going, a little bit of friction is good. And the argument they always used was not so much for fraud. Actually, BNPL is a perfect example of why a little bit of friction would have been good. Are you conscious of the fact that you just took out a loan? Did you actually, okay, you didn't read the terms and conditions because no one ever did, but has there been enough done on our side to make sure you understand that you just assumed a set of financial responsibilities? You didn't just order the nice new dress. You will pay interest. So that belief that actually, not, and again, not even for fraud, but that belief that you'll be better informed, or at least we will know that you did something consciously. But of course, the Amazonification urge is zero impulse control. So that doesn't work very well. So I think from a responsibility, particularly around lending, a bit more friction is a good thing. Yeah. It's extremely frustrating until the day you have fraud. The day after that, you're actually very grateful for it. So we can't allow the consumer experience be the driver. I don't want to name the names of the banks, but do you remember when it was? I mean, dear viewers, we're sitting in London. It started hitting the news that thousands of phones were being stolen daily when people were either on a call or on a map in the hopes that the device is unlocked. And I remember watching it with my partner who's not in finance, and they were like, what's the resale value? And I was like, give me a second. Because, of course, I have every banking app out there, right? Give me a second to see how many of my banking apps open without secondary authentication if my phone is unlocked. It was about a third of them.
Was it really? Yeah.
Now it's none of them.
Yeah.
But at the time, it was about a third of them.
Yeah.
So if you were one of the people whose phone was stolen and before you knew it, your particular, I won't name them, but your particular bank was empty within minutes because... and then you try to make a fraud claim and it's not.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. We did some research last year, actually, that was end user research, so consumer research, effectively sort of the likes of you and I, and anybody who uses sort of financial services platforms. One of the questions we put to people was, do you consider a business's record on fraud prevention as a factor before you sign up? And overwhelmingly, I was a high 80% or something, to say that they did, and not only that they would welcome some more friction into the process because it gave them a sense of, well, these guys do take this seriously, and that's something that that we should be, we appreciate. We feel like our data is going to be safe there. We're not going to be hacked, and they will support us in the event of a fraudulent attack or something like that too.
I wonder how high the percentage would be if you asked a follow-on question of, have you had a bad experience before? Because I can definitely, obviously, I started being a bank customer way before the digital era hit. And I switched my bank twice in that period of more than a decade after fraud on my account that was handled poorly. Yeah. And will never go back on the back of that, and the memory is strong 20-odd years later. So people will welcome that friction when they've had the bad experience. But I think it's also a constant iteration on what the options are.
Yeah.
Because, the bad guys are creative. They're super creative.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that one of the things that we sort of points out too, actually sort of following on from that piece of data there, and I think I thank you for that suggestion, because we are going to repeat that survey next month actually, so I will work that question in there too, just to find out that data. I'm curious about that too. But one of the things we sort of sort of extrapolate from this piece of information is that fraud prevention has previously been seen as kind of a business cost, something you have to sort of tolerate, and it's a sort of a negative aspect to it within financial services institutions. What we're saying here is if actually your customers are welcoming this, and not only that they want it, they're demanding it, all of a sudden fraud prevention and robust fraud measures have become a customer acquisition strategy. Because if you can demonstrate that you are holding this to the highest possible level, that's going to attract people in.
100%, because we are transitioning from a period where, when I had fraud on my account in pre-digital era, in the pre-digital era, the onus was on you to prove that you protected the physical assets that the bank gave you. Was your card cloned? I don't know. Did you lose your checkbook?
Yeah.
Children, checkbooks. And although invariably the consumer was made whole, it was a very difficult process. But your mum would always say, keep your checkbook at home and your card, in your pocket and all the rest of it. Now, of course, you need to keep your device safe. But in a world where we have all sat watching news programs about Taylor Swift videos that weren't Taylor Swift, and a few months back, the CEO of DNB, the Norwegian bank, put on her LinkedIn post a video of her authenticating a pretty major transaction that went to their Singapore office, and actually it looked, felt, and sounded right. It was not, and it was intercepted, which I think is also a good story. Otherwise, I don't think it would be on LinkedIn. So if you're a consumer coming in to the fray now, if the great and the good are not safe, then little old me definitely isn't safe. So what would have been a pain 10 years ago is a top of mind concern now.
Absolutely. And how seriously do you think leaders within financial institutions take that? Do you think it's something that they want to be building that sort of trust process into the very beginning of an interaction with a customer? So when they first go through onboarding or something like that, possibly. Is that something that they're taking, do you think they're taking seriously enough, or is it not given as much of a priority as perhaps it should be?
I'm hesitating because the reality inside a big organization is that 80-90% of your time is taken up by things that are on fire that from the outside look like they should be resolved in a moment. So, for instance, the world is on fire with conversations around fraud, conversations about AI capabilities, stable coins, this, that, and there will be about, I'll just throw a random number out there, 30 compliance and risk teams in the square mile around us who right now will be on the third day of a bitter battle with their chief product officer around whether a particular set of product parameters went through the appropriate governance before being shown to a customer focus group. Yeah. That's the reality of our lives. So it is very rare that the leaders will come to what is important from a standing start. That's why regulation becomes so important, because it forces us to make space for things. Excuse me. I think anyone who's in the process of building a new customer proposition now, any consumer-facing, retail consumer-facing solution, they need to think about this. And they should be thinking about this, and they are thinking about this. The context, so if you're in Brazil, you're thinking about it in the context of what happened with pigs. If you're here, you're thinking probably more in terms of deep fakes, how easy it is to produce a really convincing video that will pass a liveness check. But you are thinking about it. If you're sitting in an organization that isn't actually doing anything new in that space, you're not because you don't care, but because other things are on fire, which is why we need the regulator to step in and go, guys, the world has changed. We talk about consumer duty first. How can you keep your consumers safe if you don't think about their identity first and foremost?
Absolutely, yeah. And what do you think? What are some of the approaches that you've seen business leaders take to dealing with that problem? That kind of, you mentioned sort of the conflict sometimes between a product team and a compliance team, or a product team and a fraud team, and so on. How have you seen? What are some of these? Do you have any examples of how people are tackling that problem without the necessary push for regulation so far? That's not there yet.
So usually the driver was simplification, particularly for consumer banks. It was customer feedback, customer frustration that when I come for a credit card and I come for a mortgage, you treat me like I'm a different person. I already have my mortgage with you. Can you stop sending me mortgage offers on my current account? You know I have a mortgage because A, it's you, and B, it's paid out of the same account, for crying out loud. So I have seen quite a lot of organizations coming into this space from simplification. And it's both a system simplification with an associated cost component and a customer journey simplification. But because it's inward facing, so you're doing it to create fewer clicks, less friction for the customer, and a cheaper and lighter tech stack, weird and wonderful incidents can happen. And I have said this story in the past where I was part of an effort like that, and we were creating a single customer view, which meant we had a single identity asset, and there was very interesting work that had to be done underneath by the likes of you guys on how do we create the right permissions so that you hold all the information for me, but it's not accessible where it's not needed, right? Not rocket science, although at the time it was very new. So we built all of that, and it worked really well. And we were very proud of ourselves because we could demonstrate that there's a but coming, right?
I do, yeah.
The customer experience was great and the cost. And then compliance came into the room late. Always invite them in early. Always invite them in early. And we're like, this is great, but what about people on witness protection? Yeah, what about them?
Yeah. Yeah, those kind of edge cases are.
We had not been given that use case.
Yeah.
And the entirety of our effort, there was no way to accommodate that. So the options were, you offboard all of them. How many of them can there be? That was my approach. How many are there? That was not obviously palatable. We hack something into the system, adding a few months and a bit of cost. That wasn't hugely palatable. Or we keep the old system running for those guys only, creating additional complexity, which is what happened.
Yeah.
Now, if you're doing this work driven from a product or infrastructure, you'll do some good stuff, but you won't do holistic stuff. That's where actually having an identity baseline from a government, be it an Aadhaar or... Now, I come from a country that has national identity cards that have just been digitized, and the digital identity asset has less information than your physical card, as it should. But that now creates guardrails for the banks that want to lean in. And actually, there's a bank in Greece that can do eKYC now using that asset in, I think it's 15 minutes. Yeah. Now, I'm sitting in London going, why does it take so long? But in Greece, they're like, that used to take weeks.
Yeah, yeah.
But the guardrails are there. Without those guardrails, you'll make mistakes like the one we made. And you want to hide your head in your hand and scream, you didn't give me that use case at the same time. So you do need that. Yeah. You do need those guardrails.
It's very interesting. And so we're doing some really interesting work actually with a newly launched bank. So this is a brand new entity that's just launched in the UK, actually, which I think is, they're able to have that luxury of sort of doing all this for the first time, I suppose. The question that leads to is that's not the luxury that any other financial services organization. No. There's quite often a lot of just legacy stuff that they have to unpack and sort of unpick again. How do you tackle that problem? Because that's surely another layer of complexity that comes into it when you're talking about those guardrails as well.
It's a huge layer of complexity, and as you've already worked out from the answers I've given you, I am very much of the opinion that you should actually spend a big portion of your day as a technology leader switching stuff off. That is not something we're very good at. Yeah. And I don't think we even need to get into the reasons. We can if you want to, but I think everyone knows why. But we're not good at that. Now, every time you decide not to switch something off, you carry complexity, both system complexity, but also you reduce your overall architectural resilience. You carry everything from different test and release schedules and different engineering teams to just a different security posture. You create extra vulnerability in the system. Yeah. Now, when it comes to identity, that is true on identity and fraud. That is true on a million levels. If you are carrying stuff, you're probably carrying additive regulatory provisions. So actually, this isn't about fraud, it's about resilience. But I was speaking to a friend who runs a payments company, and she was saying that as part of DORA, they're going through all of their paperwork to find the inconsistencies that have been accumulated over the years. Because if your SLAs are slightly different across the lifespan of a client relationship, chances are it's not a problem. But if now that's a regulatory posture, it matters. Yeah. So think about all the regulations that have changed in terms of GDPR alone, retention. If you haven't switched any of your old systems off, I'm pretty sure you have some retention issues somewhere, right? So I think there is a regulatory posture, regulatory debris, one of my friends call it. And like it's very good, right? I'm stealing it. You can have it as well. So you have system complexity, where you probably have things not done right or things overproduced, over-engineered, bad. You have regulatory debris, so you're doing certain things that are no longer needed, or you've extended things to bring them up to speed, but you may be taking the scenic route, which could be a problem, both in terms of vulnerabilities, but also in terms of your data having little stays in place where it shouldn't. Then you have new threats. And then you have the constant debate of what actually constitutes a robust identity asset. What information should you have? What information should you not have? So in big conglomerates, for instance, so banks tend to have global footprints. Not all of them, but a lot of them do. In some countries, it is obligatory that you capture gender. In other countries, it is optional and or indifferent. And in other countries, it's highly contentious. I have one particular bank in mind that their parent conglomerate owner organization comes from a jurisdiction that expects it, has cascaded through a lot of their systems. They've made, and there's that information retention. Now, if you're coming in to implement an identity verification system, it isn't just about what information do I need from you, how will I process, verify, and return it, how will I store what I did without. It's also avoiding overexposure of data that shouldn't be there.
Yeah.
We're terrible at that. Actually, I would say that one of the biggest things is that we're doing more than we should with information that shouldn't be there, overproducing because we haven't tightened the sort of regulatory posture and what we hold. So again, long answer to your question, if you're sitting inside an existing organization, you have all of that complexity. Chances are you don't even know that you have it or where it is. So I worked with a bank a few years back that had this strange system that essentially would offboard customers when they came of age. So if you opened a junior account on the night when the clock strikes midnight on your 18th birthday, you were automatically offboarded and re-onboarded. You didn't necessarily know that anything changed. You got a really nice letter from the bank saying, welcome to adulthood, and a new card. But they actually offboarded and re-onboarded for reasons that have everything to do with the systems not being designed properly.
Yeah.
The problem was that the people who did that hadn't spoken to the people who had mortgages, because how many 5-year-olds have mortgages? Actually, quite a lot of people, particularly if they're divorced or one parent is deceased, put children on mortgage deeds for protection, but that didn't carry. So now you have 2 people, but they don't know they're 2 people. So when they come in to verify, you're looking at them, they're looking at you. Obviously, it happened 2-3 times. We fixed it. But those things happen all the time.
Yeah. What's sort of practical advice would you give someone who's in one of these roles where they're sort of starting to tackle one of these problems? I mean, I think this is probably a general digital transformation. You know, what are the sort of the watch outs? What are the sort of the 5 key steps or something like that that you can point to?
There are a couple of things that you almost need to have as a mantra to yourself. The first one, and I wish somebody had said it to me when I was younger, is that the fallacy of looking at something that is so insane that you think there must be a reason why we're doing it like this. It's just above my pay grade and nobody has told me what it is. Chances are there was a reason once upon a time, but there isn't one now. So actually, when you see something that is inefficient, problematic, and when we're talking about identity, actually contravening some of our regulatory obligations, don't assume there is a reason. Don't assume someone above your pay grade is doing something about it. Yeah. They might, but they might not. So that's question number one. The second thing is actually a win if you're sitting in the identity space, which is if you're trying to drive transformation, bring innovation, if it's pure upside, you'll be fought bitterly every step of the way. With good reason. People believe in what they're doing. People are fatigued, nervous. They're not bad people, but they will fight you bitterly. Yeah. If you're coming with something that increases the safety and security of the organization, increases resilience, and aligns with regulatory obligations, you will find budget and support. It's still an uphill struggle, but you will find budget and support. So if you're coming into this space with a creative mindset, I would say keep it, but align it to a regulatory imperative. It will make a lot of the journey not easy, but easier. I think the third thing we already talked about, you need to switch things off, particularly in this space. And I remember talking to someone recently, in a really, really large institutional bank, and we were talking about data, and they were saying that they've really started leaning into data governance, that the things we were saying 10 years ago have really hit home. And I was like, great. Does all your data have a sell-by date? Like, do you know when it expires? And their little face. I knew that I was going to get that little face, but it was like, oh, another thing. So yes, another thing. You need to switch things off, and that is going to be the hardest thing of all. But I do hope that, particularly in the identity space, particularly in the regulatory space, we will start seeing those moments of where you're in breach of your duty of care, because by dragging that thing along and that thing along, you compromise ABC. That, of all the things I mentioned, that will be the hardest thing.
Yeah.
And then the last thing, I'm going to go back to my cab driver again. There is white space here. For the first time in a long time, there's white space here. So to go back to my cab driver, can the system know you're scared? It can, actually.
Yeah.
Should it? That is the conversation we need to be having, because there isn't a straightforward answer. The technical possibility is there, but we need to have these discussions. We were talking about friction and flexibility earlier. Well, this becomes more existential. Friction, safety, or not, actually. Would your life be in more danger if the phone locked down? Or would that communication reach the bad guys and they would stop kidnapping you? There is such a big social impact component here that becomes an identity verification question that we need to lean into it creatively. There are no right or wrong answers. You will feel strongly one way or another. We need to start thinking about all the other stuff, because we need to get to this stuff. This is the stuff that is going to define whether we move into a society that is empowered by all our digital riches, or becomes a dystopia like the movies I liked to watch when I was 15. Now I don't like to watch them because they're too close to the bone, right?
That's very true. And actually that leads into, I'm very conscious of time, but this leads into my last question, which is, if you were to have a crystal ball, what would you envision digital identity looking like in 5 years from now? What do you think it's going to be like?
If you catch me on a good day, I would go against my original point of you need it to be very, very simple. And I would actually allow it to be very rich, biometrically rich, so that it has a million ways to verify it's me. And because actually, the whole, when I remember when we first saw facial recognition, it's like, if you shave your mustache or I cut my hair, does it still know it's me? How does it still know it's me? Now we know how that works, and we're comfortable with it. And it still knows it's me if I have sunglasses on, but not if I'm drinking coffee while I am doing my authentication. And you'll ask a 10-year-old, and they know that. Should your device be able to recognize your pH? Should there be... Because we now have haptics as part of this. So on a good day, my view is that my identity is rich, and it should actually be able to be informed and enriched by all of those things, because actually it will be much harder to hack if all of those additional bits of information and triggers and protections, the digital identity equivalent of, are you really trying to buy gym equipment in Tanzania when your phone is sitting in Hoxton? If we capture all of that information and update it with the speed we can update it, then actually we create a much more secure asset, provided the motherlode isn't hacked, right? Because I know what they... So on a good day, I want to see that. On a bad day, when I've just had a few scary meetings with CISOs, I want to move to a harmonized baseline digital identity asset globally. Because the reality is that if we don't have that, a lot of other things won't happen. The people who suffer the most tend to be the poorest of the poor. Their access to services is compromised. Their access to banking is compromised. So actually, if we can't bring that richness, then at least bring a baseline that creates something that is robust, governed, and expected. Because that will force people to think within those guardrails. It will create some reusable public infrastructure componentry. It will guide our creativity. It will force some of the debris to be cleaned out. And then step by step, we can get to a place where actually it becomes more secure by being richer.
Yeah, I really like that. And I think it's so interesting too that we've started off talking about financial services, but I think that the knock-on effect for all of this is a societal issue, really. I mean, it's down to people's safety, it's down to inclusivity, and all of these big things. You know, you're mentioning people about sort of the marginalised or the those edge cases, if you like, that fall into this sometimes, that are sometimes the ones who suffer here. So it's a bigger picture than I think than perhaps we sort of started at the beginning. But plenty for us to explore next time. We're going to have to do this again. I always, I'd say what you mentioned earlier on, I was watching some of your videos from it. I always find your insights, really refreshing, actually, and I think it's a really good way of sort of approaching it. So that's all we've got time for. It's shot by this time, I know, but it's really good. So thank you again for your time. I really appreciate it. And so I know you're an incredibly busy person, so thank you for stopping by.
It's been fun. Thank you for having me.
Great stuff. And thanks for listening, everybody. We'll catch you next time.